The leader of the opposition will say prayers. Deputy leader of the opposition will say prayers.
Morning, members, let us pray. Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power are derived, we beseech thee so to direct and prosper the deliberations of the Legislative Assembly now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundations for the glory of thy name and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our sovereign lady, Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all who exercise authority in our commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established among us. Especially we pray for the governor of our islands, the premier, the speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the leader of the opposition, ministers of the cabinet, ex officio members, and members of this Legislative Assembly, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May the Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace now and always. Amen.
Please be seated. Proceedings are resumed.
Reading by the Honorable Speaker, messages and announcements.
There are none.
Morning, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Georgetown Central.
Just by way of point of order, I just want to highlight a security matter from last night that I brought to your attention and hope that it will be resolved today in respect to the back gate being open and can't be closed. By all means, I don't think we're in a state in our country where security is that big of a risk for us, but basically the gate is open that anybody from the public can walk into the back.
Honorable member, I'm sure the Sergeant at Arms has heard that like everybody else has by now. And so he will attend to it as soon as possible.
Presentation of petitions.
None.
Presentation of papers and of reports. Tourism Attraction Board financial statements, 30th of June 2014. To be laid on the table by the Honorable Premier.
Honorable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Deputy Premier is speaking at an event this morning, and in his absence, I beg to lay on the table of this Honorable House the financial statements for the Tourism Attraction Board of the Cayman Islands for the year ended 30th of June 2013.
So ordered.
The Tourism Attraction Board of the Cayman Islands financial statements ended 30th of June 2013.
Premier.
To be laid on the table by the Honorable Premier.
Honorable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of this Honorable House financial statements of the Tourism Attraction Board for the year ended 30th of June 2014.
So ordered.
Statements by the honorable members and ministers of the cabinet.
There are no statements.
Personal explanations.
There are none.
Obituary and other ceremonial speeches.
None.
Raising of matter of privileges.
None.
Government business. Bills. The appropriation financial years 2018-2019 bill 2017. Continuation of debate on the budget address, the through-in speech, together with the government policy statement.
Continuation of debate. Is there any other member wishing to speak? The deputy opposition leader, the member from Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to give my debate on the government budget, policy statement, and throne speech. But I'd first like to begin by congratulating the PPM-led government on being able to produce a budget that, as per the Premier's comments in the policy statement, represents the policies and priorities of the coalition government for the next 4 years or 2 years. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the difficulty that the government must have faced in bringing together so many ideas from so many different individuals who were all not from one party. As a matter of fact, we have representatives now in the government from two parties that I think represented one of the biggest political rivalries this country has ever seen. And in addition to that, a number of independents. So I can appreciate, Mr. Speaker, how difficult an exercise it must have been to actually pull different priorities and policies from everybody's manifestos and put them together in one concise plan. And so I congratulate the government for doing that. The Premier said in the policy statement, Mr. Speaker, this government continues the work, the foundation that was laid by the previous PPM administration. And that is quite clear from the number of capital projects and so forth that I see the government embarking on or continuing in this current term. Mr. Speaker, the Premier mentioned being nostalgic about his government's first budget, being this new government's first budget, and it's a budget that is put together by his coalition partners. And I'm also today, Mr. Speaker, feeling a bit nostalgic because this is the first time I think that we've had an opposition that has been so well organized and working together as a team to provide a response to the government's position. And I would like to genuinely thank my leader, the leader of the opposition, the member from Northside, for the leadership role he has played in bringing all of this together on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, and providing direction and leadership and organization to our group. I think he is to be congratulated for his efforts in advancing our democracy. And it is quite evident how seriously he takes his role in the way that he leads this group and the respect that he has for our democracy. So I want to thank him. And I also want to thank the other members of the opposition, Mr. Speaker, including the independent member from Georgetown Central, who all play integral roles in what happens on this side of the House. I'm also feeling nostalgic today, Mr. Speaker, because in 2 months will mark the second anniversary of my departure from the Progressives. And well, while I do miss some of my colleagues on the other side, and some who have now departed, I do take note that many people in this country and in this honorable House predicted that that would be the end of me politically, and that I would lose the people's mandate and not be returned to this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, despite the odds, with God's blessing and with the help of the people of Newlands, I am blessed and honored to be back here to continue serving my people. Mr. Speaker, I took careful note of your comments yesterday to this honorable House when you laid out basically the code of conduct that you expect from members on both sides. And I wish to assure you, Mr. Speaker, that showing respect for others has never been an issue for me. I can only hope and pray that the respect that I give will be returned. And I hope that all members paid close attention to your words, sir. So I just wish to assure you that I fully intend to comply with your instructions and with your wishes, and that I will do my best to follow them. And Mr. Speaker, if on occasion I slip, I want to say no, it's not intentional. I'm still learning, and I am certain that you will correct me if necessary. But with all due respect, sir, thank you. Because I do have the utmost respect for the chair, sir. Mr. Speaker, I wish to talk about comments that have been made to some of us on this side. And they may have been made by way of constructive criticism or advice. But some have said to us that we should not be so critical of the government if we want to get things done. And I'm taking that message to mean that we must all try to work together. But with all due respect to the chair, Mr. Speaker, and all members here, I sincerely hope that no honorable member of this House expects that while being respectful and following the rules of the House, I plan to give this government a pass or a blight. Mr. Speaker, I am here to do my job. I will do so respectfully, but my work will get done. Mr. Speaker, I owe nobody on the government side anything. And I hope there are no assumptions that I do. So you don't have to like me. And I know there may be some who don't like me. But you do have to respect that the people of Newlands put me here to represent them. And I am going to represent them to the best of my ability. So I don't have to be nice to anyone. They don't have to be nice to me. But let's not mistake that for how this member needs to get things done for his constituency. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, you supported me politically. And for that, I can only tell you thank you. I don't believe you have any expectations of anything else from me other than a heartfelt thank you, sir. And I think I touched on the behavior part a little earlier in my opening remarks. But Mr. Speaker, nobody is going to determine my political future but me. I am not going to bow to intimidation or threats. I will not be censored, and I will speak on behalf of the people of Newlands as long as I have breath in my body. Mr. Speaker, like the member from Bordentown West, I have faced many tough situations in my life, including being airlifted and uncertain whether or not I would survive, and being told by doctors here that there was nothing more they could do for me. I went to university in Chicago, Illinois, Mr. Speaker, and I oftentimes survived in neighborhoods that were so gang infested and controlled by crime that I often wondered if I would get out alive. I have been beaten by members of the Chicago police. I've had a pistol stuck in my face. But I have survived all those hardships, Mr. Speaker, because I believe there's a purpose for me to survive. And I'm here. Mr. Speaker, the Premier sent his biggest and baddest to Newlands and Central to take care of myself and the member from Central. I don't believe he came himself. He may have once or twice, but Mr. Speaker, David defeated Goliath. And I will not go into great detail this morning, Mr. Speaker, on the tactics used to try to eliminate myself. But I remember those lessons. But Mr. Speaker, with the support of colleagues on this side of this honorable House, I survived. So for the time being, Mr. Speaker, I am here. And I will work with anyone who wants to work with me. But let's not confuse my niceness and cooperation for weakness. Mr. Speaker, last term, with the support of colleagues on this side of this honorable House, we stopped one of the most powerful lobby groups in this country in stopping the passage of the Legal Practitioners Bill. And I often like to quote, to lighten the moment, Mr. Speaker, from one of my favorite movies, Young Guns. And there's a little quotation I always use, but it says, see, if you got 3 or 4 good pals, why then you got yourself a tribe. And there ain't nothing stronger than that. This is, Mr. Speaker, the government's first budget. And as I remarked earlier, I understand how difficult it may have been for the government to pull this together, and I begin by congratulating them. There's another reason today, Mr. Speaker, why I'm feeling nostalgic. In doing my research and digging through numerous papers I have at home, I came across a document that you yourself may remember, Mr. Speaker, when we were just after the election, and we were all meeting to see if we could form a government. An agreement was presented to me titled Agreement for a Unity Government for the Cayman Islands. I think, Mr. Speaker, this came from individuals in your party. And what is different about this one, Mr. Speaker, is that it has signatures on it, but it was signed by members who were at the time sitting with me and your good self, sir, and members of your party. So it seems that despite the contention that the members on this side are not worthy of leading this country, there was a time that we all were sitting together discussing forming a government of national unity. I won't discuss what happened after that, but this document we had gone as far as signing. And I take note that, Mr. Speaker, what was presented to me at the time of discussions were options for forming a government. And what was communicated to us was that the offer presently on the table to the CDP from the independents was unacceptable, which was, at that time, I believe, when the member from East End was slated to become premier. And the second option presented was that two or more independents could possibly defect to the PPM to form the government, which would consign the rest of us to the opposition benches. Another option, Mr. Speaker, was that the independents would attract 2 or 3 PPM.
Honorable member, can you tell me where you're going with this? Because none of this is contained in the throne speech, nor the budget, and it has not been referred to by any member. And I don't think that, unless you're going to make some cogent point that I'm not yet seeing, that you should continue on with that, in that vein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only point I was making is that the Premier made reference to the country voting for the government on the other side in his statement. And I was simply pointing out, Mr. Speaker, that when we were discussing it, the formation of what now exists on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker, was referred to in this document as the nuclear option and least appealing at the time.
I think you have sufficiently
Yes,
covered, if that's what you're speaking to, you have sufficiently covered that, or in answering that, if that's what you were doing. I think you should move on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd just like to lay this on the table for
I
posterity.
would like to see it first, though.
Sure.
Before any document is tabled, I'd prefer a speaker and presiding officer to see it. Honorable members, the presiding officer has the right to call for any paper before it's laid on the table of this honorable house. And if that were not so, all kind of things could be brought into this house and dumped on the table. That's one not signed. Only one of these documents I've signed, and I recognize my initial to it. The other one has nobody's signature to it, and it could be put together by anybody and said anything. I will not allow this one to be tabled, but the one that called for agreement for a unit of government, the Cayman Islands, certainly, it's public knowledge. This other one is not public knowledge, and I don't even recall seeing it, but it does have various names to it. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yeah, I will move on now. Time does move on, as the Premier has rightly stated in his statement.
Yes.
Time marches on. Mr. Speaker, in terms of just a housekeeping matter as well, in reference to your ruling yesterday, and I'm not defying your ruling, sir, but just to explain why we chose to call ourselves a shadow government.
Honorable member, we have passed the stage for that. And if you so, or anyone on the opposition side so wants the public and this house to understand that, then you can bring a substantive motion to do so. There's room for that. But there's no room for that in the debate on the throne speech, nor the budget that has been laid before us. Please continue on the debate on that. Member for Georgetown Central, do you have a point of order?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
And the point of order is?
For an explanation of what is the scope of the debate, because based on the past three...
Honorable Member for George, that's not a point of order, but I will tell you. The scope of debate is what the order of the day says. The order and business papers for today says the appropriation financial years 2018, 2019 bill, 2017, continuation of debate on the budget address and the throne speech, together with the government's policy statement. That's what is up for debate. And that's what the member from Newlands is debating. And I would suggest that he continue with that debate on those two items.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's just a little difficult for me because I've been accustomed to using the terminology. So please, I'll beg your forgiveness if I slip and say shadow at any point during this.
Honorable member from Newlands, you know very well because you've been here long enough, and I've been here longer than you, and there are times you slip, but this is one slip that can't continue. You already made this point publicly, but it cannot be made in this assembly because there is no such provision. And I think you understand that, and you're trying to drive it home, but you can't because I know different. So let us agree that you're going to continue in the good way you have started, but don't bring in these extraneous matters that don't exist and have no room, no law, no rule.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will also refrain from using the term counselor, as that is also not a provision in the Constitution, sir.
It's in law, though. Yeah, it is. You wouldn't understand.
So, continuing with my debate, sir, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
I have been tasked with responsibilities in relation to this budget to speak to certain areas that are currently the responsibility of the Honorable Premier. In particular, human resources, immigration, and community services. And I will reserve my comments, keep my comments focused on the budget in these areas. And later on, Mr. Speaker, I will try to fit in some of my constituency concerns and a general overview or position from myself, if time permits, but just to assure the listening public that I intend to fully focus on constituency issues during Finance Committee. So, Mr. Speaker, in the area of human resources, immigration, and community affairs, the government plans are to allocate budget for spending in the following areas: enhanced policing, enhanced work permit system, improved border control, services for the elderly, disabled, seamen, veterans, and indigents. Mr. Speaker, this spending plan, I think, rightfully highlights areas that are critical to this country and areas where attention is severely needed. I don't think anyone will argue with that, because a lot of these areas we've heard members campaign on, talk about in the media, and the public at large has voiced a lot of concern in these areas. So I have no argument with the government on choosing those priorities. Mr. Speaker, crime continues to be a major concern for these islands. And the number of armed robberies, which seem to be an almost daily occurrence now, continue. And I know that the government and the police are trying to make efforts to get that under control. And Mr. Speaker, in particular, I'm concerned about our young people, because many of our young people are becoming victims of violent crimes, but some are also becoming the perpetrators. And I'll expand on this a little bit later on, Mr. Speaker. But this is a major concern for us. And the reasoning why so many of us on this side talk about education, technical and vocational training, social programs, attention to drug abuse, and so forth among our young people as key concerns that need to be addressed, not in the longer term, Mr. Speaker, but immediately. Mr. Speaker, it is the government's responsibility, as we all know, to prioritize resources and policy to address the root cause of any threat to our economic and social stability. And I note that in the Premier's statement, he talks about economic and social stability. But I have to really question, after having listened to that statement and read it and perused this budget, whether or not this budget is going to deliver on the promises, Mr. Speaker, for stability, empathy, and prosperity. Mr. Speaker, when you drill down into human resources, I'm pleased to see that one of the major promises being made here is the creation of a human resources department. And I think all members on this side support that development. Some members of this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, will remember last term I brought a motion, private member motion number 1, 2016-17, titled Mandatory Job Registration where I asked the government to consider making it mandatory that every vacancy in this country be registered with the NWDA. The government accepted that motion as it was in line with their policy at the time. And now I'm hearing about the introduction of a national jobs clearinghouse, which I think will encompass most of the suggestions I made in that motion. But, Mr. Speaker, in looking at the budget, I note that the majority of the cash is being committed to funding for policy advice to the Honorable Premier. And while I understand that there is going to be a necessary component for advice and consulting in order to get this done, I have to question whether or not there are resources enough in this budget for the training and retraining of personnel involved, for the development of information systems, which will undoubtedly, Mr. Speaker, be needed. And perhaps the biggest component will be the re-engineering of existing processes, workflows, and information flows. Most people with a business background or even a technical background will understand what that means, Mr. Speaker, because clearly you can't just simply move functions from one area to the next without looking at how those functions are interrelated, what information is needed for those functions to work properly, and how the flow of work fits in between them. I see this as an attempt to dismantle the sort of siloed approach, Mr. Speaker, that we have suffered from for quite some time. And it is encouraging. I know that when I was with the government, I played a small but involved role in some of this groundwork. And it's pleasing to me to see that it's now being delivered. But I have concerns, Mr. Speaker, that there are going to be some impediments to getting this done, given the budget outlined. However, I know when the honorable member responds, he may give some more clarity, or in Finance Committee, those details may come out. But on the surface, based on what I've seen, I'm concerned that there may not be sufficient resources. And what I would fear, Mr. Speaker, is that in 2 years' time, we have a lot of consultancy reports and plans and the inability to implement them. Because I think 2 years is too long for Caymanians to get some relief in this area of employment. Speaker, the Premier says I should have stayed and made it happen. But I can assist him from this side. This is something that is important to the country. It's a national concern. And I did complain when I was with the government, but I also was frustrated at the lack of attention that was being paid to these matters at the time. So I'm glad to see it now, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as I said, I'm supporting the things that the government brings that I think are good for this country. And my comments are constructive and I'm not trying to tear down anything that the honorable member is trying to do in this area. Mr. Speaker, cheap labor, as referred to by my colleague from Bordentown West, continues to plague this country. And it continues to threaten not just the future prosperity but the very existence of our middle class Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, we would be smart in being mindful of the fact that looking at what is happening in the United States, immigration has dramatically increased the size of that nation's low-income population. Mr. Speaker, many immigrants in the United States will make significant progress the longer they live in our country. But even with that progress, Mr. Speaker, and I'm talking about economic progress for them, immigrants who have been in the United States for 20 years or more are still more likely to be living in poverty, lack adequate health insurance, and access the welfare system a lot more than native-born Americans. So I think we need to be mindful of the experiences of other countries in this area, Mr. Speaker, who have allowed the influx of cheap labor to continue. And we know why it happens, Mr. Speaker. Let's not sugarcoat anything. Profit. It is attractive to a business owner to bring in someone who's going to work longer hours because they have no family here, no family commitments, and who are going to accept a lower pay because of the exchange between our currency and their home currency. And they will agree to come here and suffer for a time. And I'll talk a bit more about how that gain shows up in their home countries. So, Mr. Speaker, even with equity investments of $6 million 2018, $6.5 million, $7.6 million 2019 being split between the police, immigration, border control, Coast Guard, human resources, I am concerned that these initiatives are going to suffer from underfunding, under-resourcing, and will suffer implementation delays. And I'm basing that on my experience, Mr. Speaker, in the past as the project manager. And hopefully it will be taken in a constructive manner. Mr. Speaker, I also, in the area of immigration, think that there's some items missing from the government's plans. In the 2013 to 2017 term, the Progressives government were producing a labor relations bill. However, that bill hasn't seen the light of day. And in my opinion, having had the benefit of being involved in some of the early discussions on that bill, Mr. Speaker, I was in support of it. I believe that that bill would have addressed many of the lingering labor issues that have been revealed through public consultation, stakeholder input, and our constituents. And I think that now would be an appropriate time, Mr. Speaker, for the government to consider reintroducing that bill in tandem with the creation of a human resources department. Mr. Speaker, this country needs labor reform. We need to improve in that area. And anyone who listens to their constituents on a regular basis will know what I'm talking about. And I'm not just talking about those people who may have an axe to grind or a chip on their shoulder. I'm talking about people who are being discriminated against, pushed out of organizations. Mr. Speaker, the government is introducing a radical new approach to dealing with labor in this country. And I think it's time to, in tandem, evolve our labor market, modernize it. In implementing these changes, Mr. Speaker, the government is going to have to deal with a raft of older legislation, changes, amendments, and some may be difficult to fit into the existing legislation simply because those older pieces of legislation have been amended so many times. But I think the creation of a new Human Resource Department is a fresh new start, and hand in hand with that, Mr. Speaker, should come a new labor law. Mr. Speaker, I feel we'll be missing the boat in many areas if we do not take advantage of the opportunity to do this now. That new labor relations bill was supposed to address concerns in areas of unfair dismissal, constructive dismissal, termination for failure to perform duties in a satisfactory manner, redundancy and termination monitoring. Mr. Speaker, we've all heard the stories of the redundancies and how it is almost impossible to determine at times if a redundancy was really a redundancy or if it was a convenient excuse to get rid of someone. I've had too many people come to me and complain and tell me about their experiences for me to dismiss what happened to them as sour grapes. Caymanians have been made redundant unlawfully in this country. The new labor relations bill was supposed to address concerns in the area of initiation of proceedings for unfair dismissal, remedies for unfair dismissal, and victimization. I am sure, Mr. Speaker, that the government can find the resources necessary to pick this up once again and push it forward. And they will have my support in doing so. But as I started to talk about earlier, Mr. Speaker, cheap labor in this country. And I think the consequences of us being so free in allowing cheap labor into this country have now been well documented. The concerns have been well documented. The influx of cheap labor, whereby we import poverty into this country, Mr. Speaker, is playing a significant role in the erosion of our social and economic condition. I really don't see in the budget where the government, Mr. Speaker, has given this any priority. But I can tell you, without fear of contradiction, that our appetite and addiction for cheap labor has caused wages to reduce right down to minimum wage, which I support because at least it provided a floor, or the wages would have probably gone lower. And we see that in job ads, Mr. Speaker, where the qualifications for the job in no way, shape, or form match the salary being paid for those jobs. Overnight, a lot of jobs became minimum wage jobs when the minimum wage law requirement was passed. But it was a good thing that we at least implemented a floor. Mr. Speaker, Caymanians are disadvantaged by the cheap labor that we're allowing into this country. And you know, I am not blaming the laborers themselves. I am blaming some of those businesses who are in the pursuit of profit, and they have every right to earn a profit, Mr. Speaker. But when you neglect your own people to do that, I think that is where the government needs to take a more active role. Most Caymanians, Mr. Speaker, will not and cannot live in substandard housing. We cannot work excessive hours voluntarily because we have families here. We have children to raise. And we most certainly are not able to pool resources with 6 or 8 other people who are sharing the same living accommodations as us. But Mr. Speaker, the cheap laborer will voluntarily endure being exploited because the conditions in the country where they originate are much worse. The economic benefit, Mr. Speaker, that they receive here, when they receive their salary in US or CI dollars, is mind-boggling. You can build a decent, and when I say decent, I mean middle class, 3-bedroom house in the Philippines from foundation to ceiling to roof for $20,000 US. So you can imagine what 4-5 years in this country does for the average cheap laborer. The benefits that they receive here last a lifetime when they return home. And again, I am not blaming them, Mr. Speaker. If I was in that economic condition, I would be looking for opportunities too. And I feel for some of them when I see the level of exploitation that some of them go through. The way they're treated, Mr. Speaker, you wouldn't treat your dog. But it happens here for the sake of profit and greed. I may be chastised by many for being quote-unquote anti-business, but their business is their business. My business is to make sure, Mr. Speaker, this country does not continue a regime that allows the exploitation of cheap laborers. It not only ruins our reputation, it can ruin lives. We see the effects on our middle class. We keep hearing the talk about foreclosures. Mr. Speaker, when this country went through a recession and many businesses downsized or made redundancies or went to the employees and said, we have to reduce your salaries, a lot of those Caymanians who were working at the time, who either lost their jobs or had to take lower pay, or lost their job and went and found a lower paying job, they had mortgages. The monthly payments on those mortgages were calculated at a much higher salary than they're now making. So is it any surprise that so many of us are going into foreclosure? I know in some instances people were able to refinance with the bank, but in a lot of instances, Caymanians were not able to. And the bank continued to expect them to maintain the same level of servicing, debt servicing, when they entered into that mortgage. We hear the cry, Mr. Speaker, for legislation protecting individuals when they fall into default on their mortgages. And I think it is badly needed, and this is the time to bring it. I asked when I was, and the Premier talks about me leaving his government, This is one of the things, Mr. Speaker, I asked for. And the response I got from the then Minister of Financial Services was people need to manage their money better. I know many decent, hard-working Caymanians who are insulted by that comment. They have no money to manage. So, Mr. Speaker, we can't continue with the just importing poverty into this country, exploiting foreign workers, and allowing cheap labor to reduce wages in this country. Everyone on this side supports business, Mr. Speaker, and we support development. But we do not support exploitation, and we certainly do not support the erosion of our middle class into poverty. Mr. Speaker, on the area of immigration, I find it shocking in the budget that the government anticipates revenues from work permits, PR, Caymanian status, and the like to amount to some $209 million across 2018 and 2019. In this category, Mr. Speaker, revenue for 2015-2016 was $62 million. And in 2019, jumps to $72 million. Based on the government's promise that there will be no tax increases in this country, Mr. Speaker, I also have to make the assumption, and I think it is reasonable, that the only way this revenue is going to increase is if we increase the number of work permits and PR grants, Cayman status grants. And I also support the notion, Mr. Speaker, that in this country, it is now time for us to strongly consider only granting Caymanian status through descent or marriage. I know this flies in the face of what many consultants like to preach, is that we need to increase our tax base. We need to allow more people to come here because we're consumption tax driven. And the more people here spending money, the better it will be for us. But look at the projected jobs that are going to be created over the next 2 years. They're less than the number of work permits we're going to be granting. Someone on the other side will explain to me, I'm sure, that I got this wrong. But if you're creating less jobs than you're bringing in work permits, some Caymanians are going to have to go home. Who are we catering to, Mr. Speaker? Who does this budget cater to? I do not see the importance being placed on the average, middle class, and lower income Caymanian. The majority of my constituents in Newlands, Mr. Speaker, are middle class Caymanians, hard-working middle class Caymanians, who want nothing more than the opportunity to provide for themselves and their families, educate their children, and not have to deal with government policy that is going to make it difficult for their children to get jobs and for them to potentially lose their jobs and their homes. And that is happening. I have seen middle-class Caymanians, Mr. Speaker, when I was growing up in this country, who I looked up to and respected and always thought of them as doing good for themselves. Where are some of them now, Mr. Speaker? They're coming to me in fear of losing their homes, with no hopes for educating their children beyond high school, and no hope for the future. And that is not something, Mr. Speaker, I wish to be a part of. This budget needs to do more for the average middle-class Caymanian family. I've been preaching it now for over 4 years, and I sound like a stuck record, but I'm going to keep preaching it till somebody finally listens to me. My major concern, Mr. Speaker, is employment for the hundreds of young Caymanians we turn out onto our job market every year from our high schools. 20% may go on to university. 80% are out there looking for jobs and they cannot find them, Mr. Speaker. They come to me, they come to my office, and they tell me, I have applied for 20, 30 jobs, and not one call back. They have applied to the government for jobs, and they're qualified to do these jobs, and they do not even get the courtesy of a reply email to say you were chosen or not. They're asking me to call up someone at this department or that one to just find out for them if there's any chance they're going to be interviewed. We saw here, Mr. Speaker, in Public Accounts Committee, what has been happening at the HSA, our own government hospital. And I'm not here, Mr. Speaker, to bash civil servants, but I have to speak the truth. We can no longer continue this way of being politicians who are afraid to speak up on behalf of our people. If I messed up, I don't think anybody would have any hesitation in pointing their finger at me and telling me I messed up. It would be all over the press. It would be everywhere. So I'm not willing to cover up when I see something wrong happening in this country. And I don't care where it's happening wrong. Right is right and wrong is wrong. And I live by that. Mr. Speaker, we have to find a way, and I know it can't happen overnight, to reduce government's reliance on work permit revenues to fund its operations. But unfortunately, what I'm seeing here, it seems as if the easy way out is to focus your policies on increasing that consumption base, that tax base. And because Caymanians are not, I guess, not having children fast enough, they're not growing up fast enough, we are importing bodies. That may look good on a balance sheet, but it is not looking good for our people. We are doing this at the expense of our own people. And Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk a little bit about education shortly. But this policy of budgeting for an increase in work permits, despite what I've heard the Honorable Premier say, Mr. Speaker, that the more work permits we have, the more opportunities for Caymanians, that correlation would work if Caymanians were getting the opportunities, but they're not. The only ones benefiting are the business and the imported worker. In case, Mr. Speaker, there is any doubt that the exploitation of cheap labor is happening here, I'm going to give you a little example of something that was brought to my attention recently. There's now it's being investigated, so I'll be careful how I talk about it, Mr. Speaker, but I'll talk in very general terms. There is now documented evidence that locally licensed companies, Cayman Islands licensed companies, are engaged in the practice of extorting wages from cheap laborers who they act as agents to bring into this country. Some of these people, Mr. Speaker, owe money. Because you know, in most underdeveloped countries, the banking system is not as advanced as ours. Somebody need a loan, they go to a loan shark. These people owe money back home. Their families may owe, their uncle may owe. And they are brought here on a temporary work permit and farmed out to some business. And part of that requirement is that they pay back that debt that they owe at home or their family owes at home from their wages. In another scenario, they are being contacted, Mr. Speaker, to come here, pay their airfare, pay a finder's fee to the agent of about $5,000 US. Come here on a temporary work permit, and when they get here, the job is falling through, but you now have 3 months to go find another one. And they show up at our local businesses begging. Why are they begging? They have nothing to their name here. They are penniless, desperate. And these are locally licensed with a trade and business from the Cayman Islands, government, companies doing this to people. And we continue to turn a blind eye to this. I may be arguing, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the imported laborers now, none of them can vote for me. But it is wrong. And wrong is wrong. And I can't really blame the immigration department because I know, in speaking to them, I know that their hands are full. But we have imported a state of, a condition of lawlessness in this country that has to stop. It is degrading our standard of living. And we cannot continue to allow businesses to just do this kind of thing unchecked and then brag about the increase in the number of business licenses we issue, when some of them are licensed thieves and criminals. Mr. Speaker, this practice can only be described as evil. And all of us in this honorable house need to take a stand against it. These foreign influences are using this country to profit, and they're destroying our reputation. They are destroying our standard of living. I don't need to tell you how many illegal business operations are going on here, people who are not even licensed, who somehow get in here and decide to set up shop doing something that they don't have a trade and business license to do. And I know that the authorities are trying to crack down. But unless a collective position is put out there that this government is not going to tolerate it any longer, and I know a lot of us are soft-hearted and caring people, and we don't want to stop a man from making a dollar, but think about the effect of that on your own people. Mr. Speaker, how effective and practical is the current immigration law? The immigration law, in my opinion, was set up the way it was because at the time we needed to import people here to work. We needed people to come here and help us build. I've seen over time where the strong protections for Caymanians have been watered down. And there have been a number of amendments to the immigration law. And I think that if the government is going to take a radical approach to reforming labor and the processing of work permits, it is also time we take a look at the immigration law and decide whether or not it is still fit for purpose. Do we need new legislation? Do we need to repeal and replace the current immigration law? Because in my mind, I am starting to form the position, Mr. Speaker, that it's not fit for the needs of this current time. I know there have been issues with individuals who are employed by the Immigration Department, which falls under that law, is enabled by that law, who may misinterpret the intent of the law. I wouldn't say it's a mass problem, but there are incidents where people have argued and had differences of opinion on whether or not the law meant one thing or another. I think we need a clear, concise, from the people, immigration law to take us forward. And again, in the midst of all this reform, perfect time for the government to do it. And you would have, again, my support in doing it. But this has to be done after careful consultation with the primary stakeholders in this country, Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, persons are gaming our immigration system. I don't know if anyone in this Honorable House is aware that there are individuals here who have 2 work permits, one in the Cayman Islands and one elsewhere. And what they're doing is undermining us because they can accept an accounts position for less money than we could. Why? They have income coming from another jurisdiction. So they come here and they'll underbid us when they apply for the job, so to speak. And the organization they're working for moves them back and forth between the Cayman Islands and another jurisdiction. And they make up the difference there. So they're making more money than us. But as far as we're concerned, they're doing the job cheaper than we would. There are people, Mr. Speaker, who apply for permanent residence here, knowing full well they do not qualify for it. But they're using that, Mr. Speaker, as a means to stay here longer. Their goal is not to become a permanent resident. Their goal is to stay here and continue working because there's a backlog of applications. It takes time to process, and they get to stay until a decision is made. That has to change. We either need to speed up the processing or we need to stop them being able to stay here indefinitely, especially when their application looks as if there's no chance in the world that they will get permanent residence. They're gaming the system. Mr. Speaker, just looking at the revenues in work permits from 2013 through 2017, work permit revenue increased 47 million. It was 47 million in 2013. And in 2017, it is 72 million, an increase of 53% under the Progressives government. And the Progressives said, the Premier says, Mr. Speaker, that this means more jobs and opportunities for Caymanians. Has the living conditions and working conditions for Caymanians increased correspondingly in that time period? No. Mr. Speaker, I'll touch briefly on the high cost of dealing with irregular immigrants because it falls under this area. But I do feel with the Deputy Governor on this one, as he and I have discussed the difficulties it is, and we must provide a humanitarian approach to dealing with refugees. But I really have to at least make the suggestion that we try to re-engage the Cuban authorities as often as possible because they should be bearing some of this cost. And while we are the Caymanian people who are friendly, inviting, and caring people, we are also spending $2.2 million a year dealing with refugees. And that takes away from our ability to do things for our people. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
Member, you have 57 minutes left in your time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just trying to pace myself because I do have a lot of information written down, a lot of points, and I want to try to cover as many as possible. Mr. Speaker, another area that I'm very concerned about, and again, in doing this, I may be calling out certain people, but it's only in the hopes that things will improve. But the immigration regulation schedule 3H recognizes a provision, Mr. Speaker, where scholarships by businesses can be part of an agreement to approve a business staffing plan. But I'm concerned that not much attention is being paid to these scholarships, these obligations, because once that plan is approved, it becomes an obligation by the business. Mr. Speaker, I sent in an FOI request recently asking for information on how many of these scholarships have been agreed to, how many have been dealt with, how many have been given to Caymanians. And the initial response coming back was, we need 30 more days to get back to you. And I know that it might just simply be a resourcing issue, but I would have thought, Mr. Speaker, that somebody would have that information to hand, because someone needs to be monitoring that. Someone needs to be able to say to these businesses when they're renewing their business staffing plan, why haven't you given scholarships to Caymanians? You're not getting another approval until you do that. In the same vein, Mr. Speaker, I know personally of 2 Caymanians who are now away in university. And through the good graces of one of my constituents who actually can afford to do so, received assistance from him just to cover groceries. We have Caymanians who are trying to better themselves, going away for tertiary education and can't afford it, and yet we don't know how much money sits in those business staffing plans that could be given to the scholarship secretariat to give to our young people to help them. Mr. Speaker, $20,000 a year, we all know, doesn't cut it for a scholarship. When I went to university, I graduated in 1994, Mr. Speaker. DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. My fees were close to about $60,000 a year. So I can only imagine. I know people try. People try and they struggle with their children and they borrow. But we shouldn't have to mortgage our children's education. It pays huge dividends. And I know that there's some provision in here for increases. I'll wait for Finance Committee to see exactly how much. And I know that we reduced the amount so that we could help more people. I understand that as well. But I think the priority on scholarships needs to increase tremendously. I know it's an added cost, but let's take that money from somewhere else. You're investing in your people, in your future. That pays huge dividends. We won't see it this term. None of us will be able to go out and campaign and say we created 10 new Caymanian millionaires who are now employing 50 Caymanians apiece. But the future will smile fondly on us for doing it. And that's why we're here, the future. I know things have changed. I see the young Caymanians coming to me, telling me that they've applied for scholarships and so on. One is now trying to find work within the prison system as, I guess, an apprentice. He wants to become I think it's a clinical psychologist. He wants to come back and help our prisoners. And he's having difficulty finding employment just to get some practical hours that will apply towards his master's. He has a bachelor's already. And he's not having much luck. He just wants to work somewhere as a junior counselor or something. No help. And he can't return to university because he can't afford it right now. And he wants to work to save some money towards doing that. I mean, that is ambition. That is a young Caymanian who is taking his future into his hands. And what are we doing to help him? I personally am calling around and emailing people, begging them, please give him a chance. But sometimes that hurts them because the politician calling up feels like I'm strong-arming a business into hiring a Caymanian. I shouldn't have to do that. They should be embracing our young people, calling us for names. Mr. Speaker, we are creating a Coast Guard. Long-awaited Coast Guard, and I, again, support this. I know how the drugs and the guns get into this country. It's not on Cayman Airways. Might get one or two. They get caught, seems like. But those canoes are coming in. I think they may even have shipping schedules designed now. Because, and I'll be careful how I say this, but there are people in my district, not necessarily Newlands, who could make comments about whether a boat is coming or not and when to expect it. So it seems like we've set up an underground shipping network that operates on a regular basis. May even be more reliable than our public transport system that we have here. And items are contraband is coming and going. But I don't see, again, Mr. Speaker, much support in this budget for the proper establishment of a Coast Guard. I don't see how all the equity injections being spread across all these areas of radical change, which is, I agree with radical change that the Premier talks about, is going to be enough to get all of this done. And it comes down to priorities, Mr. Speaker. 6.5 million for 2018, 7.6 million for 2019. I don't think that's going to cut it. It is difficult, Mr. Speaker, to see how this is going to be enough to create both a Coast Guard, a human resources department, with all that re-engineering that's going to have to be done. The outline business case for the jobs clearinghouse alone, Mr. Speaker, called for 159,000 from capital and a further 423,000 from recurrent. That's a lot of money for one component of a re-engineering project that is going to affect multiple departments. And I'm under no illusion, Mr. Speaker, this is going to be an expensive undertaking. And my advice to the Honorable Premier, Mr. Speaker, is that he really look at the resourcing available to him to get this done. Because I don't want to stand up here in 2 years and have to make comments about his failure to get it done. I'd prefer to get up here and congratulate him and support him for doing it. So careful look needs to be given to the scope of these projects and the resourcing that will be provided. Mr. Speaker, moving on to a suggestion I'm going to make, and it's something I raised when I was with the progressives. And I think it is something that on the surface might sound like one of those pie in the sky dreams, but it is something that worked for us in the past. And there's enough evidence that it worked then, and in a modified and reintroduced way, it can work now. Mr. Speaker, all of us come from a fishing heritage. Our forefathers and those who have come before us survived on the sea. Mr. Speaker, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea designates an exclusive economic zone to these islands, which is some 119 square miles or so beyond the coastline of this country. This zone is to be used exclusively by the Cayman Islands. And some of the things that are covered in this agreement is the exploration, exploitation, conservation, protection, and management of the natural resources within that zone. I don't see much mention in this, any mention of this in the government's plans, but I know I raised it a number of years ago as an area that we could potentially develop to benefit our people. And while we are now looking at establishing a Coast Guard, because you will need an element of enforcement and protection if you move forward with what I'm about to suggest. While we're looking at plans to develop a Coast Guard, let's make sure we take into consideration what I'm saying here today, Mr. Speaker. Because I think we are depriving ourselves of an opportunity to preserve and reintroduce a traditional way of life and industry and to expand upon it. Mr. Speaker, we could provide opportunities for Caymanians to become licensed operators within this zone, creating jobs. No one knows more about fishing than our people. There's more than enough expertise here. And this zone is now being exploited by other countries around us. The irony is, Mr. Speaker, they bring the seafood here and sell it to us, and it was taken from our economic zone that we should be protected. And when it gets here, the quality has degraded because oftentimes it's been at sea for a number of days, and there's no control over the price. We could very easily, Mr. Speaker, create a market here where our licensed fishermen can go out, catch seafood, bring it back here, sell it at the market price. The government could simply tack on a small tax to cover their cost of regulating this market and then get involved with distributors to distribute it to purchasers. What we have now at sea is the wild, wild west. The prices are not set according to any market. It is what I want to sell my fish for today. And that's why you see such a difference in prices of seafood depending on where you go to eat. There's no quality control. By doing this, the government would be introducing a new or reviving an industry that so many of us descend from. And I think, Mr. Speaker, it is out-of-the-box thinking with benefits for Caymanians. We need to start to look at diversifying our economy. We can't primarily rely on financial services and tourism, but there needs to be some diversification. As our population grows, as our strengths grow, we're going to need to provide other forms of employment for our people. There's no shame. We all came from that heritage. There's no shame in being a professional fisherman or woman. So, Mr. Speaker, there are added benefits to this proposal. We would protect and preserve that economic zone. Again, we would license Caymanians to operate in it and supply seafood to these 3 islands and maybe beyond. We would create regulation and pricing and quality standards. We would boost our conservation efforts by having a further reach beyond our shores, and we would be preserving a Caymanian tradition. This is just a suggestion I'm making to the government. They can take it or leave it. But at the time of implementing a Coast Guard, I think it's a smart thing to consider. Mr. Speaker, turning to community affairs, I am disappointed in this area, and this is where I stop being so complimentary. Because I don't see much foresight and planning to improve services to our people in this area. Mr. Speaker, one of the most critical areas in government is providing services for our most vulnerable, the indigent, the young, and elderly. And this budget is woefully lacking in this area, despite claims in the strategic statement that it's getting priority. I don't see it in the budget. Mr. Speaker, this country is projected by the government to make a surplus of $141 million over the next 2 years. But what I am seeing in this budget, Mr. Speaker, is that the needs of our elderly and our at-risk youth in particular, are not being met. And we are pursuing other priorities at their expense. The policy statement, Mr. Speaker, talks about stability, empathy, and prosperity, a plan for sustainable social and economic development. I see some economic development there, Mr. Speaker, but I don't see much social development. And I am disappointed. It's hard to find the empathy. Mr. Speaker, when one considers the increased spending on the police, which I support, and the prison, it is quite clear where we're heading. Community affairs is tasked with providing for the well-being of at-risk youth, maintenance of public shelters, public education on social issues, residential care for the disabled and children, social inclusion, housing for indigents, support of older persons, the boys' home and the girls' home, care of children on remand or committed, school lunches, NCVO children's services, foster care, community social programs, accommodations for those in need, burial assistance for the indigent, and support for battered women and children. I don't see any significant increase in services for any of those categories. There are increases, but they're meager. The total increase, Mr. Speaker, from the 2016-2017 budget is a measly 0.9%, unless my math is bad, but I did it twice. 0.9, not even 1%. And the increase from 2018 to 2019 will be approximately 7%. But, Mr. Speaker, we are increasing spending on the prison by 122%. The budget for the prison will be more than half the budget for community services. Mr. Speaker, government policy seems to be to ensure that we have the capacity for the impending social breakdown of this country. That is what I'm seeing in this priority plan. And not much attention is being paid to the root cause of what is putting our people in that prison. I understand the prison, there are human rights concerns, there's overcrowding concerns. I know you can't have so many people packed in, confined in one place without an eventual eruption. And I know I'm almost done. Got another 15 minutes. Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Honorable members, we're going to take the lunch break until 1:15. So we'll take the break at this point until 1:15.